It began, as so many tragedies do, with something ordinary. A text message. A young woman typing out her plans for the night, a quick trip, a friend she trusted, nothing that felt unsafe. The kind of digital footprint millions leave behind every day without a second thought. But in Ridgewood Heights, New Jersey, in the late autumn of 2016, that message would mark the beginning of a dark trail. One that would reveal how a quiet, polite young man used modern technology as his hunting ground. Before we continue into the haunting details of Khalil Wheeler-Weaver, make sure to subscribe to K-Script Vault and join us as we reopen the cold cases time tried to bury. At 19, Robin Daphne Michelle West was full of contradictions. Bright but restless, sweet but fiercely independent. She drifted between jobs, trying to find her footing in a world that didn't offer many easy paths. Her friends described her as the girl who could light up a room, but beneath that spark was the weight of uncertainty, the kind that so many young women quietly carry. On August 31, 2016, she was last seen getting into a silver car outside a cheap motel on the edge of Ridgewood Heights. Surveillance cameras caught the vehicle pulling away. After that, Robin simply vanished. For 2 weeks, no one knew where she was. Her phone went silent. Her social media froze. And then, firefighters responding to a late-night blaze behind an abandoned home discovered something they could never unsee: a body burned beyond recognition. DNA testing later confirmed what her friends already feared. It was Robin. Investigators had little to work with. The house was derelict, the fire deliberate. Whoever had done this knew how to erase evidence. But behind that calculated act, a faint digital echo remained, a record of Robin's last phone activity. An app used for social connections, a text from an unfamiliar number. At the time, no one realized that number would appear again, and again. 4 months later, the cold December air hung low over Ridgewood Heights. Holiday lights blinked weakly along cracked sidewalks. The city's edges, gas stations, alleyways, old rail yards, all seemed to hum with an uneasy stillness. That's when Sarah Butler, a 20-year-old college student, disappeared. Sarah had been home on break from Montclair State University. She was bright, athletic, and deeply loved, the kind of young woman whose life revolved around family. On November 22nd, she borrowed her mother's car to meet someone she'd been texting. The messages were casual, even flirtatious. She mentioned the man was offering her money to hang out, something her friends found odd but not alarming. Sarah promised she'd be back in a few hours. She never returned. When her family realized she hadn't come home, panic set in quickly. Sarah's friends logged into her social media accounts, tracing the digital threads she'd left behind. There, buried between ordinary posts and emojis, they found the same unfamiliar number that had texted Robin West months earlier. Detectives were brought in, and for the first time, a pattern began to take shape. The man behind that number was Khalil Wheeler-Weaver, a 20-year-old security guard from a nearby town. Polite, quiet, no criminal record, the kind of young man who wouldn't stand out in a crowd. He came from a good family. His mother worked for the city. His stepfather was a retired police officer. But what no one saw behind his reserved demeanor was a growing obsession, a fascination with control, submission, and the power to make someone vanish. As detectives dug into his phone records, a haunting timeline emerged. In the weeks before Sarah's disappearance, Wheeler-Weaver had been using dating apps, not for connection but for selection. He scrolled through profiles of vulnerable women, sex workers, runaways, those living on the margins, women whose disappearances might not make headlines. They found GPS data placing his phone near the abandoned house where Robin West had been found. They found overlapping patterns, the same text exchanges, the same coded language, the same predatory rhythm. But the break investigators needed came not from the police, but from the people the killer had underestimated, the victim's friends. After Sarah's disappearance, a small group of women began digging on their own. They created fake profiles. They studied the digital breadcrumbs, and eventually they found him using the same name, the same app, the same photos. They arranged a meeting, working with police behind the scenes. On December 1st, 2016, when Wheeler-Weaver showed up expecting another victim, he was instead met by officers waiting in the dark. But even in custody, his calm was unnerving. He denied everything. No emotion, no panic, just a steady, chilling composure. As investigators combed through his digital life, the scope of his crimes began to unfold like a map of obsession. There was Joanne Browne, 33, last seen alive in October. Like Robin, she'd been struggling with homelessness. Surveillance footage placed her in Wheeler-Weaver's car. Weeks later, her body was discovered in an abandoned house less than 3 miles from where Robin had been found. Then came Mawa, just 15 years old. She disappeared from her neighborhood earlier that same year, in May. Her case hadn't been connected until detectives found Wheeler-Weaver's cell signal pinging near her last known location. Mawa's remains were never officially identified, but her absence still echoes through her family's life like an open wound. Each victim, investigators realized, had been lured through trust, text by text, message by message. Wheeler-Weaver's method was chillingly modern, a killer who didn't stalk from shadows but from screens. When detectives pulled the GPS history from his phone, it revealed the route of a predator, each movement time-stamped, each location precise. They watched the digital reconstruction of the nights of the murders play out in data points and coordinates, cell towers, Wi-Fi connections, app pings, all forming a map of horror that was both invisible and undeniable. The prosecutor would later describe his phone as a silent witness to his crimes. In the courtroom, that witness spoke louder than anything else. The trial began in the fall of 2019. By then, 3 years had passed. The victims' families filled the benches, holding photos that once smiled in brighter times. The air inside the courtroom carried that strange mix of grief and anticipation, the need for truth, even if it hurt to hear it. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically. Surveillance footage of Robin getting into his car, cell tower data placing him near both fire scenes, Google searches that read like a diary of intent. What does bleach do to blood? How long does it take for a body to decompose? Each search, each click, a quiet revelation of a mind unraveling. In one chilling detail, investigators found that after each killing, Wheeler-Weaver returned to the scenes, sometimes hours later, sometimes days. He'd park nearby, linger, watching as police worked. Whether it was out of curiosity or pride, no one could say. But the act itself spoke volumes, a man drawn back to the silence he'd created. Defense attorneys tried to paint him as misunderstood, claiming others had access to his phone. But the precision of the data, the synchronization between his shifts as a security guard and the time of the murders, told a different story. Then came the most haunting moment of the trial, the victim impact statements. Sarah Butler's mother, in a voice trembling but unbroken, looked directly at Wheeler-Weaver and said, "I do not want you dead. I want you to suffer. I want you to think about what you did to my child for the rest of your life." Her words didn't draw tears, not from him. Not even a flicker of remorse crossed his face. To the jury, that silence was louder than any confession. In December 2019, Khalil Wheeler-Weaver was found guilty on all counts: 3 murders, 1 attempted murder, kidnapping, and desecration of human remains. The judge called his acts pure evil, sentencing him to 160 years in prison, a number meant not only to punish but to protect. Yet even with justice served, questions lingered in the corners of the story, questions about how he chose his victims, how easily he slipped through the cracks, how society too often looks past those living on the margins until it's too late. In interviews years later, detectives would admit that the case haunted them, not because of its brutality, but because of its logic. Wheeler-Weaver wasn't impulsive. He wasn't chaotic. He was deliberate, patient, and disturbingly methodical, proof that the face of evil doesn't always snarl. Sometimes it smiles. And for the families left behind, the sentence brought only partial peace. They would never again hear the laughter that once filled their homes, never again see the bright futures they'd imagined for their daughters. Robin's friends still gather every August 31st, lighting candles near the corner where she was last seen. The flicker of flames reflected in the cracked pavement has become a quiet protest against the darkness that took her. Sarah's family started a foundation, one dedicated to teaching young women about digital safety, the small ways predators hide behind ordinary screens. They call it Sarah's Circle. And somewhere in the city, the memory of Joanne Browne lives on through her sister, who still visits the abandoned house where she was found, now covered in murals, her face painted among them, her story sealed into the brick and concrete. Each woman's life now forms part of a painful mosaic, the pattern left behind when obsession turns to violence, when one man's hunger for control devours everything in its path. Khalil Wheeler-Weaver will never walk free again. But his crimes changed more than his own fate. They forced a reckoning in policing, in technology, in the fragile trust that exists between strangers online. For investigators, this case became a warning about the digital age, how our lives, mapped in data, can be both the weapon and the evidence. In the end, what condemned Wheeler-Weaver wasn't a witness who saw him, but a phone that did. A trail of numbers, signals, and timestamps, the ghostly fingerprints of a killer who thought he could disappear behind a screen. In Ridgewood Heights, the streets where Robin, Sarah, Joanne, and Mawa once walked are quiet again. But beneath that quiet, their stories still hum, a low frequency of loss, memory, and resilience. And as the camera lingers on the faint glow of their memorial candles, the narration softens not into silence, but into remembrance. In the end, Sarah's story became more than a tragedy. It became a warning, whispered through the digital noise of a world that never truly forgets. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice was truly served? This is K-Script Vault, where every shadow hides a story.